On August 12th, 2000, the Russian nuclear submarine Kursk left port for what was supposed to be a routine naval exercise in the Barents Sea. The Kursk wasn't just any submarine, it was one of the largest and most advanced submarines in the Russian Navy, stretching longer than two jumbo jets placed end to end. The vessel was considered unsinkable by many in the Russian military, a symbol of their naval power even after the fall of the Soviet Union. If you love deep dive documentaries, make sure to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss an episode. 118 sailors were on board that day. These were experienced men, trained for years in the art of submarine warfare. Many of them had families waiting at home in Vidyayevo, a small naval town on the Kola Peninsula where most of the crew lived. Some had children who had just started school. Others had wives who were pregnant, waiting for their husbands to return from what was supposed to be a 2 week exercise. The Kursk's mission was straightforward. They would participate in war games, simulating combat scenarios with other vessels in the Russian Northern Fleet. Part of the exercise involved firing practice torpedoes, a routine procedure that submarine crews had performed thousands of times before. The weather was good, the sea was calm, and there was no reason to expect anything would go wrong. Captain Gennady Lyashin commanded the vessel. He was a respected officer with years of experience, known for being cautious and thorough. Under his command were some of the best submariners in the Russian Navy, men who knew the Kursk inside and out. They had trained together for months, running drills and preparing for exactly this kind of exercise. At approximately 11:30 in the morning on August 12th, the Kursk submerged beneath the surface of the Barents Sea. The submarine descended to its operating depth, and the crew began their preparations for the torpedo exercise. Everything was proceeding normally. The men were at their stations, going through the familiar routines they had practiced countless times before. But in the torpedo room at the front of the submarine, something was about to go catastrophically wrong. At 11:28 and 27 seconds, seismologists across northern Europe detected an unusual event. Their instruments registered a disturbance in the Barents Sea, equivalent to an explosion measuring 1.5 on the Richter scale. It was significant enough to be noticed, but at the time, no one knew what had caused it. 2 minutes and 15 seconds later, their instruments detected something far worse. A massive explosion, this one measuring between 3.5 and 4.4 on the Richter scale. The blast was so powerful that it registered on seismic equipment in places as far away as Alaska. To put that in perspective, this second explosion released energy equivalent to several tons of TNT, detonating simultaneously. What happened in those 2 minutes between the explosions has been reconstructed through investigation, though the exact sequence of events may never be fully known. The most likely scenario is that a torpedo in the submarine's forward compartment began to leak hydrogen peroxide, a highly volatile propellant used in Russian torpedoes. When hydrogen peroxide comes into contact with certain materials, it can ignite spontaneously. The first explosion was the torpedo detonating inside the submarine. The blast tore through the forward compartments, killing everyone in the torpedo room and the two compartments directly behind it instantly. The force of the explosion was so intense that it buckled the submarine's double hull, a hull that was supposed to be able to withstand direct hits from enemy weapons. The first explosion would have been devastating enough on its own, but it triggered something even worse. The Kursk was carrying a full load of torpedoes for the exercise, and many of them were stored in the forward compartments. When the first torpedo exploded, it set off a chain reaction. 2 minutes later, multiple torpedoes detonated simultaneously in what investigators would later describe as one of the most powerful non-nuclear explosions ever to occur at sea. The second blast ripped the front of the submarine apart. The entire bow section, containing the first three compartments, was essentially destroyed. The force was so great that it created a shockwave that damaged nearby vessels and sent a plume of debris shooting up from beneath the ocean surface. The Kursk, once a symbol of Russian naval engineering, now lay crippled on the ocean floor at a depth of approximately 350 feet. The forward section of the submarine was a mangled wreck, but in the rear compartments, in the sections that had been far enough from the blast to survive the initial explosions, men were still alive. In the minutes after the second explosion, the survivors in the rear compartments would have been dealing with complete chaos. The lights were out. The submarine had lost all power. Emergency lighting would have provided only dim illumination as the men tried to understand what had just happened. The submarine was equipped with 9 watertight compartments, designed so that if one section flooded, it could be sealed off to protect the rest of the vessel. This design had just saved the lives of everyone in the rear compartments. The blast doors between compartment 3 and compartment 4 had held, preventing the explosion and flooding from reaching the back of the submarine. 23 men had survived in Compartment 9, the very rear of the submarine. These were not frontline combat sailors, but mostly engineers and technicians who had been working in the engineering spaces when the explosions occurred. They found themselves trapped in darkness, with no way to communicate with the surface and no way to know if anyone knew they were still alive. Their training kicked in immediately. The men knew they had limited time. Even though their compartment was intact, they were facing multiple life-threatening situations. The submarine's nuclear reactor had automatically shut down after the explosions, which was good because it meant they were not in danger of radiation exposure. But without power, they had no heat, no lights, and most critically, no way to remove carbon dioxide from the air they were breathing. The temperature inside the submarine began to drop rapidly. The Barents Sea, even in August, is freezing cold, and without heat, the metal hull of the submarine would eventually reach the same temperature as the water outside. The men gathered together in one section of the compartment, huddling for warmth. They had access to emergency breathing equipment, chemical canisters that absorbed carbon dioxide and released oxygen. These were their lifeline, but there was a limited supply. The sailors knew they had to use them carefully, rationing their use to make them last as long as possible. Meanwhile, on the surface, the Russian Navy was trying to piece together what had happened. The Kursk had missed its scheduled communication check-in. This was unusual, but not immediately alarming. Sometimes submarines maintained radio silence during exercises. However, when the Kursk failed to surface at its designated time, concern began to grow. By the evening of August 12th, nearly 12 hours after the explosions, the Russian Navy officially declared the Kursk missing. Search and rescue vessels were dispatched to the area where the submarine was last known to be operating. It did not take them long to find it. The Kursk was sitting on the ocean floor, and sonar showed significant damage to the bow section. The Navy immediately began preparations for a rescue operation. They had rescue submarines, small vessels designed to dock with a disabled submarine and evacuate the crew. But there were problems. The rescue submarines were old, poorly maintained, and their crews had not conducted a real rescue operation in years. The equipment had been sitting unused while the Russian military dealt with severe budget cuts after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The first rescue attempt came on the evening of August 13th, more than 24 hours after the explosions. A rescue submarine was lowered to the Kursk's depth and attempted to dock with the rear escape hatch, the only way to reach the men who might still be alive in Compartment 9. The attempt failed. The rescue submarine could not get a proper seal on the hatch, possibly because the Kursk was sitting at an angle on the ocean floor, or because debris from the explosion had damaged the docking mechanism. They tried again and again. Each attempt took hours, lowering the rescue submarine, maneuvering it into position, trying to establish a seal, and then bringing it back to the surface when the attempt failed. The clock was ticking, and with each failed attempt, the chances of anyone surviving inside the Kursk grew smaller. To help this story reach more people, please like, share, and subscribe with notifications turned on. For the families waiting in Vidyayevo, the first days after the disaster were a nightmare of confusion and conflicting information. Russian military officials were tight-lipped about what had happened, releasing only minimal information. The families were told that there had been an accident, that rescue operations were underway, but little else. Russian television showed footage of rescue vessels gathered above the site of the wreck, but there was no information about whether anyone had been rescued, whether anyone was even alive to be rescued. The families gathered together, supporting each other, waiting for any news. On the surface, rescue teams were becoming increasingly desperate. The Russian Navy made 7 separate attempts to dock their rescue submarine with the Kursk between August 13th and August 15th. Every single attempt failed. The rescue submarine was simply not capable of completing the mission, whether due to equipment failure, rough seas, or damage to the Kursk's escape hatch. Inside the submarine, the men in Compartment 9 were running out of time. Later investigation would reveal that they survived for much longer than anyone initially thought possible. The senior officer among the survivors, Captain Lieutenant Dmitry Kolesnikov, wrote a note during those final hours. The note, found later on his body, was written in pencil darkness using a felt-tip pen. It provided a heartbreaking timeline of their final moments. Kolesnikov's note indicated that the survivors were alive and attempting to escape at least until the afternoon of August 13th, more than 24 hours after the explosion. The note mentioned that some of the men were injured, that they were having difficulty with the breathing equipment, and that the pressure inside the compartment was becoming dangerously high. The breathing equipment that was supposed to save them may have ultimately contributed to their deaths. Some of the chemical oxygen generators malfunctioned, possibly due to water contamination or improper use in the darkness. When these devices malfunction, they can release intense heat and even cause fires. Evidence found later suggested that a flash fire had occurred in compartment 9, consuming much of the remaining oxygen and filling the space with toxic smoke. Even as the men inside the Kursk were fighting for their lives, help that could have saved them was being refused. Foreign governments, including Britain and Norway, had offered assistance within hours of learning about the disaster. These nations had advanced deep sea rescue equipment, including remotely operated vehicles and modern rescue submarines that were specifically designed for this type of situation. The British had a rescue system called the LR-5, a sophisticated submarine that could dive to the Kursk's depth and establish a watertight seal even in difficult conditions. The Norwegians had similar equipment and divers trained in deep sea rescue operations. Both countries offered to send their teams immediately. The Russian government refused. For days, as rescue attempts continued to fail, Russian officials insisted they could handle the situation themselves. They did not need foreign help. This decision would later become one of the most controversial aspects of the entire disaster. It was not until August 18th, 6 full days after the explosions, that Russia finally accepted foreign assistance. By the time Norwegian divers reached the Kursk on August 20th and successfully opened the escape hatch, everyone inside was dead. The men in compartment 9, who had survived the initial explosions and waited in the darkness for rescue that came too late, had been dead for several days. Opening the escape hatch revealed the worst fears of the rescue teams. Compartment 9 was flooded and filled with debris. The bodies of the 23 men who had survived the explosions were found in positions that suggested they had been trying to use the escape equipment and waiting for rescue until the very end. The recovery operation that followed was one of the most technically challenging underwater salvage operations ever attempted. The Russian government initially stated that raising the entire submarine would be impossible, that the Kursk would remain on the ocean floor as a tomb for the 118 men who died. But the families of the dead sailors refused to accept this. They demanded that the bodies of their loved ones be recovered and given proper burials. They demanded answers about what had happened and why rescue efforts had failed. The families organized, they protested, and they put pressure on the government to do more. In October 2001, more than a year after the disaster, a Dutch salvage company succeeded in raising the Kursk from the ocean floor. It was an extraordinary feat of marine engineering. The submarine weighed thousands of tons and was partially buried in sediment on the ocean floor. The salvage team had to cut off the destroyed bow section and leave it on the seafloor because it was too damaged and dangerous to raise. When the rear section of the Kursk was brought to the surface and eventually returned to port, recovery teams were able to retrieve the bodies of most of the crew. They were given military funerals, and their families finally had the closure that had been denied to them for more than a year. The recovery also allowed investigators to examine the submarine and piece together exactly what had happened. They found evidence of the hydrogen peroxide leak, the explosion damage, and the subsequent chain reaction that had destroyed the forward compartments. They found Kolesnikov's note, which provided the only first-hand account of what the survivors experienced in their final hours. The investigation into the Kursk. Disaster revealed multiple failures at nearly every level of the Russian Navy and government. The torpedo that initiated the disaster was old and poorly maintained, using a type of propellant that other navies had phased out decades earlier because of safety concerns. The rescue equipment that failed repeatedly was outdated and had not been properly maintained due to budget cuts. But perhaps the most damning finding was the delay in accepting foreign assistance. Analysis showed that if British or Norwegian rescue teams had been allowed to attempt a rescue on August 13th or 14th, when the survivors were still alive, there was a reasonable chance that at least some of the men could have been saved. The Russian government's pride and secrecy had cost 23 men their lives. President Vladimir Putin, who was relatively new to his position at the time, faced intense criticism for his handling of the disaster. He had continued his vacation at a Black Sea resort for several days after. The Kursk sank, appearing detached from the crisis. When he finally did meet with the families of the victims, the meetings were tense and confrontational. The families were angry, and they had every right to be. They had lost their husbands, their fathers, their sons, not just because of a tragic accident, but because of incompetence and pride that had prevented a rescue that might have been possible. Some of the widows became vocal critics of the Russian military and government, demanding reforms and accountability. The disaster led to some changes in the Russian Navy. New safety protocols were implemented for handling torpedoes. The Navy invested in upgrading its rescue equipment and established agreements with foreign nations for mutual assistance in submarine disasters. There was a recognition, forced upon them by tragedy, that pride could no longer take precedence over saving lives. But for the families of the 118 men who died aboard the Kursk, no amount of reform could bring their loved ones back. The disaster left behind widows and orphans, parents who had lost sons, and an entire community that had been devastated by the loss of so many men at once. The note that Captain Lieutenant Dmitry Kolesnikov wrote in the darkness of Compartment 9 ended with a message to his wife. He wrote that he loved her, that he was sorry, and that there should be no one to blame for what happened. In his final moments, facing certain death, his thoughts were not of anger or accusation, but of love for the woman waiting for him at home. That note, more than any technical report or official investigation, captures the human tragedy of the Kursk disaster. These were not just sailors or statistics. They were men with families, with futures that were stolen from them by a combination of bad luck, poor maintenance, and decisions made by people who were more concerned with appearances than with saving lives. The Kursk submarine disaster remains one of the worst submarine accidents in history. It stands as a reminder of the dangers that sailors face even in peacetime, the importance of proper maintenance and safety protocols, and the terrible cost of allowing pride to override common sense when lives are at stake. The men of the Kursk did their duty, they served their country, they followed their orders, and when disaster struck, those who survived the initial explosions fought to stay alive and waited for a rescue that came too late. They deserved better than what they received. Their families deserved better, and their story deserves to be remembered, not just as a cautionary tale about submarines and safety, but as a tribute to the ordinary men who found themselves in an extraordinary and terrible situation and who faced their fate with courage until the very end. The Barents Sea, where the Kursk now rests in pieces, is a reminder of what was lost. 118 men who left port expecting to return home in 2 weeks. 23 men who survived against impossible odds, only to die waiting for help that arrived too late. And the families who were left behind, who still carry the weight of that loss more than 2 decades later. Their story is one of tragedy, of failure, and of the human cost when systems designed to protect and rescue people fail at the moment they are needed most. It is a story that should not be forgotten. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe with the bell icon to stay updated with our latest stories.